we're gonna let this stiffen up for just a little while before we do our next step. Well, we can do our next step, but then we're gonna let it sit maybe 10-15 minutes to be not quite so sticky, and then we'll go on to make our cylinder form. So before we let it sit for a little while, I'm going to take my ruler and just trim the ends. Here where it gets really narrow, I'm gonna go ahead and trim it on just one side. I don't wanna do both sides because I don't wanna accidentally make my slab too short. We'll trim that away at the very end. But from that squared end, I'm gonna line up my ruler with a corner there and get rid of all this kind of irregular edge. So I'm gonna just take my needle tool here. I'm not gonna go straight down because I don't wanna cut and scratch the board. I'm kind of tilting it at an angle and just dragging it along the side of the ruler, pushing down hard enough that I can feel the board underneath the needle tip, but not super hard. And then I can just like you're making cookies and taking the cookie cutter away, you can peel the scraps away, and those can go back in your bag once you have them all trimmed, and you can use them again later. So I've made one of my straight edges. I'm gonna come down to this corner, make another straight edge. Same exact thing, running my needle tool along the ruler. And if I was to measure that right there, it's just shy of 12 inches, which is about what I want it to be from corner to corner. So getting rid of the scrap, leaving that tail for now. I'll get rid of it at the end. I'm gonna take my scraps and put them back in the bag so they stay wet. So this slab, we're gonna let it sit for just about 10 minutes. You can go do some things around the house for a second. Don't leave too far because we don't want it to get hard. We want it to stay where you can bend it and move it for our next step. So set yourself a 10-minute timer and we'll come back. All right, so 10 minutes have gone by and we're coming back to our slab. So let's do a little bit of detail work on this, and then we're gonna prep our form that we're going to build the cylinder around. So if you look at the slab from stretching it and rolling it out, you might see thin, tiny crackles in it. We wanna make sure all of those are really smooth and blended together, and we call it compressing. So we're taking the particles of clay and packing them together really tightly, which makes the clay move and bend better without continuing to crack. So any cracks you see now, as we start to fold it around, they'll start to get worse. So we wanna make sure we make it really smooth and silky on the surface before we do our work. So using my metal rib, again, not straight down, but angled where it's almost flat. I'm using that rounded edge of it. And I'm not pushing very hard, just like a very gentle, steady touch. I'm just dragging that rib at that flat angle across the slab, and you might be able to see it's starting to get shinier, kind of more burnished looking as we go. Now if I pressed too hard, I could start to pick up clay and drag it away. That means you're giving too much pressure. So you can clean off that rib, put that clay aside, and ease up a little bit to where you're just a steady, gentle pressure across the slab. Keep it going in one direction. I like to go the long way, it gives you a better stroke. Once you have smoothed that slab really well, we're gonna take it, gently start to lift it from the table, and then I'm gonna lay it down, smooth side down, and I'm gonna smooth the other side as well. So smoothing away any rough parts and any of those crackles. And this, just a gentle, steady pressure is gonna compress that clay and make it more workable without the chance of it cracking and splitting. Another thing that can cause cracking and splitting is letting it dry too much. It's kind of like the difference between bending something that's like soft and malleable and bending a chip. If you bend a chip, it's just gonna pop. But if you bend something that's soft and floppy, it's gonna move and fold with you. So we wanna make sure the clay stays floppy and soft enough that it will bend around our form without causing cracks and stress along the bend. So kind of finding that perfect balance. If it's sticky to touch, it's probably a little too wet, but if it starts to get where it wants to hold its flat form, it means you let it dry a little too much. So we want to wait till it's just not so sticky, and then we're going to go on to stage 2. So that might mean a little more time. That might mean you're ready to go after these 10 minutes. We'll see. If you still have time to wait, why don't you go look around for some sort of cylinder form in your house. It can be like a metal can. I have a Pringles can that I love to use. It could be any sort of thing around the house. It could be a cup. It doesn't have to be a perfect cylinder. That'll be a little easier, but it could be a normal, slightly flared cup form. Your form that you're making will mimic the form that you're forming it around. So just think about that as you go and keep it as close to a cylinder as you can. Once you have that, if you get a piece of printer paper or lined paper, anything that's just like a piece of newspaper, cut it to the size, the height of your form, and let's wrap it around the form. This will create a surface that the clay won't stick to as much as like a metal or plastic surface. Like I said, this board pulls the water away from the clay, which also lets it pull up off the board really easily. If I was working on plastic right now, this clay would really stick tight to the plastic and grip it to where it would just you'd basically be mangling the slab if you try to lift it or pull it off. So same idea, if you're building on a plastic cup, it's gonna be really hard to get that cup form out of your clay once you finish. But if you have paper and you loosely tape the paper to the form, at the end, I'm just gonna grab a piece of tape right here and just lightly tape it. It doesn't have to be perfect or wrinkle free. The clay will kind of smooth out after that. But I'm kind of loosely taping this paper to my form so that when it finishes, I can slide the form out and leave the paper behind, and then I can peel the paper out later. So I've wrapped my form in paper. My slab has been sitting for a while. Now I'm going to make the first step of forming the clay around the form. So I like to line up the base of my form with one of my nice flat edges and make sure that that flattened end is nice and straight against your form, so your cylinder here. Then I'm going to move this camera a little closer so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to gently lift this end, wrap it up to meet my cylinder, nice and snug. I don't want it to be too loose to where it's wrinkling. And I'm going to just gently roll my cylinder form along the slab until you can see here the clay begins to overlap. So where it overlaps right here, I'm going to make a little mark with my finger, and I'm going to cut all this extra floppy clay away. So now we're getting rid of that weird rounded end. So you can also see kind of where the edge meets. So if you press it down just a little bit and pull it away, it makes its own mark. So I'm gonna go a little bit farther than that, so I have enough that it overlaps, and just do a nice straight cut down to get rid of this extra clay and make it so there's just maybe a 1/2 inch of overlap. So you can use your ruler to check that, but 1/2 inch is what I want to leave to be able to connect this piece with this piece. So I have my slab around my form. I want to keep it in its form while I do this next step. So anytime you're joining clay, something that we want to make sure we do is score and slip the clay. So what that means, scoring is scratching up the surface really finely, just a very gentle scratch, but something that makes the surface rough and kind of toothy. Slip is using your kind of clayey water to wet that and make the clay kind of wet and moist, which actually forms like a clay glue. So if I am just taking a smooth piece of clay and trying to attach it to a smooth piece of clay, they might kind of stick right now. Like that's kind of sticky just because my clay is sticky. But if this dries, that's gonna immediately just pop away. It will not stick. And you might have a handle that just falls off your cup if you're not scoring and slipping. What you're doing when you're doing that, just think about Velcro, how there's those rough, toothy edges that kind of lock in together and stick, or burrs when you're out in the woods. You wanna make a rough edge in all along this little line that we've made, this 1/2 inch overlap that will lock in with the edge of the clay here. So when I fold it over, they lock together and that becomes a whole piece of clay. It's no longer just ends that are kind of flapping and stuck together. They're actually interlocked in a whole piece, never gonna come separated again. So as I'm going, I'm gonna demo on this scrap. If you're going and you're cutting really deep, you can actually cut through the clay, and we don't wanna do that. We don't wanna, this tool is sharp enough that you can accidentally go too far. So I want you to take a practice piece of clay and just work at scuffing just the surface. You don't wanna be so light and so separate that you just have these fine separated lines. You want them to be really close together, but also pretty light to where if I'm bending the surface, it's not going all the way through. So going one way and then kind of going at an angle across it helps make more sharp edges that will interlock together. So go all the way down your side with a really gentle scuffing motion with the tip of that needle tool, all down the side. And then you can go back over it really lightly at a diagonal, and that will start to rough up the clay enough that it'll lock together really well. So do that on practice clay as you're watching this video in preparation for our meeting class. This is one of the good things to practice on your own, is getting a couple pieces of clay, scuffing one up, scuffing another one up, and then pressing them together. So I'm gonna just find where those meet, and I actually kind of like vibrate it, like wiggle my fingers a little bit, enough that those teeth are really digging into each other and starting to grab. And then you can just very gently pinch it. You don't wanna squeeze so hard that you're just mashing the clay at this point, but if I'm just gently pinching it, I'm finishing off that job. And look, that's really, really sticking. So that's the idea. Like now that that clay is one piece, everything else will break off, but what's stuck there is really stuck, truly stuck, until I wanted to, if I cut it away with a sharp object. So that's the idea that we're going for. So you can practice that on your own. That is one of the most important skills for hand building. If you can't score and slip well, then your pieces are going to you're just gonna have dry parts popping off when they're finished. So this is something I would recommend, spending some time just practicing. Keep your clay wet, try it just like I did just there, and then spritz your clay down or get a little bit of a damp sponge, get it wet again, put it back in your bag. If you have more free time and you want to play around, try making like some sort of a little sculpture out of like chunky pieces, little short coils, and score and slip them together, and just practice getting things stuck together really well. That would be a fun, just killing time project that will also help you develop a really good skill. So scoring and slipping is what we're gonna do to finish our cylinder. So to remember where we were, I had overlapped this edge, and I see where it's going to come up over the cylinder and meet this second piece of clay. So I've got that all scored. Now I need to score down this line here so that they'll actually lock in together. So setting my cylinder back down, I can unroll it a little bit so it's on top where I can really work with it. Move this in closer. So all down about 1/2 inch. It's helpful to me sometimes to sketch in the line that I want to match as I score and slip. So here I go. Just that light scuffing of the surface. I'm not cutting it, I'm just scratching it up. Kind kind of holding my needle tool really lightly as I go. So some of these here, they're pretty far apart. That's not sufficient. Like, I want to make sure I crisscross back over them to make sure it's a really fine, rough, scuffed edge. All right, so scored and scored. My clay is still pretty wet. If you've let it sit long enough that it actually is a little bit stiffer, you really are going to want to take your sponge and just get a little bit of water in the tip of your sponge and gently squeeze along that line so that it pools in the scuffs, just one side. And once you get that pooled, I want you to go back over it again. And this is going to mix the water with the clay and make what we call slip. And slip is just wet, sloppy, soggy clay. Which works actually like glue. So that kind of gets into all those teeth, and when it finally dries, it actually is solid clay, but it moves and gushes around to really fill any cracks and kind of lock everything in. So it's wet and slippery when it's wet, but then as it dries, it becomes hard solid clay, just like your actual slab. So the slip is really helpful for what we're doing here. So now that I've got both edges scored, I've got my slip scratched into that surface, I'm gonna roll this again really gently to where that overlap meets. And then I'm gonna roll it over that overlap and not pressing very hard. I'm just gently rocking, barely pressing down at all, rocking down on that seal, on that overlap, to where it begins to lock in together and seal off. So you can see the seam right here. This is an area where you have kind of designer's choice. Some people build ceramics and they love to leave their marks of the process behind. So leaving the seam where they had a seam so you know kind of how it was built. But you can gently start to work this clay by gently pressing and pushing it over. I can start to work it in to this other part of the smooth body and actually completely erase that seam, which I'll do for the purpose of this demo. But if you wanted to, you could leave it right where it was with the seam and have that be part of your clay. So a tiny bit of water, just a damp sponge. This isn't a soggy, wet sponge, but lightly damp. I wipe along the seam. That actually makes the clay really slippery, and it helps me to kind of just rub my finger along it and start to erase that mark of the seam. It's also a little bit fatter here where the clay is doubled up. You can fix that by gently pressing on it, but for the most part, I would just leave it. You won't notice it once it's not pushing down on the form. So let's just concentrate on blending the seam in. So I can use this metal rib tool again, very gently, again, really flat, not sharp and straight down, but flat and tilted. I can start to pull that along the seam. And this rib is really flexible, so I can work with it really straight, but I can also take my fingers and bend it to match my form so it wraps around that cylinder and can really help shape it to where there's not like a lump where that clay was overlapping. So I'm bending it, finding that seam, and just a steady, gentle pull to help blend the seam. Now I see more evidence of the seam, so I'm going to use my finger and just roughly smooth it. And then I can go and fix those rough marks with my rib, so it starts to look really nice and smooth. Okay, so we're going to do one more thing with the slab real quick, and then we're going to let it all stiffen up a little bit more before our next stage. So you can take this, leave it on the form, and just set it aside. It'll support itself because you have the form in the middle holding it up. But you want to handle it very gently. Handle it like you're handling a blown out eggshell, where if you squeeze, it's gonna pop and explode. But if you just cup it in your hands, letting all of your fingers just gently catch around it. You can move it without leaving any fingerprints or mashy finger marks on there. So I've got a really nice smooth cylinder form here. The bottom is joined really well. It's a little bit bumpy, but again, once I have the cylinder form out of it, I can do a little bit to fix that where it can't very well by pushing against this form. So what I'm gonna do now is start to gently wiggle my interior form, get a better grip on this, out of my exterior form. So I'm just putting my hand inside the cup. This clay has gotten a little bit tight against it as it shrinks. So as the clay is drying and stiffening up, it is actually shrinking. So it's important to remember that we want to take this out. You can see there's still a little bit of sheen to this, even though it is stiff. It's important to get the form out before it gets any stiffer, because you don't have the same flexibility, and you might actually end up just having your form trapped in there, which means the only way out is breaking your clay piece. So I've gently spun and twisted my Pringles can out of my cup, which leaves the paper behind, but that comes out easily because I can just curl up, peel that paper away. Some of it's sticking to the walls, but if you just gently work at it, you'll get it to peel away. And if there's some tiny scraps of the paper left behind, those will just burn out in the kiln and not cause a problem, so don't worry about it. We just want to get as much as we can out. So I'm just gently sliding my hand in there to pull it out. All right, so all my scraps can go in the trash. I want to show you what the inside of this looks like. So if I show you the interior, I don't know if the light is good enough that you can see, but okay. So you can kind of see the very little bit of a line that I traced to show like my outer and inner ring of the base. So that's a little bit of mark that's left behind. You can also see right here the seam on the inside that we erased on the outside. So again, you can choose if you want to work at that and get that erased, or leave it as a process sign. I think I'm going to leave mine, but how you would get rid of it is just gently with your finger, very gently, because now we don't have the support of that can. I'm just going to gently rub my finger over it, side to side, taking from the high side and pulling it over the low side. So the side that's on top, pulling it over the side that's on bottom. And that will start to erase the seam. Let's see if you can see that. So you can see my little bit of finger marks. We'll just work after I get it erased, I'll just move up and down a little bit and start to erase the finger marks too. So that's how you would do that on the inside. If you get to where you can't reach at the bottom, the end of this tool that's kind of curved works well. You need to make sure that you're supporting the outside of your piece so that you're not just pushing the clay out. But if my hand is supporting that, holding it steady, I can just carefully drag my tool along that line. Every now and then it might be good to get it wet so it slides a little better. Drag my tool along that line until the line is erased.